Imagine walking through the halls of Marvel's New York headquarters in 1989. You might expect to see Stan Lee brainstorming the next cosmic epic, or artists hunched over drawing boards lost in the details of a Spider-Man web swing. Instead, you would have encountered a short, confident man chewing on a cigar, looking every bit like he owned the world. He wasn't a creator, he was Ron Perlman, a billionaire financier. And as he toured the office that day, he wasn't being guided by an editor or a writer, but by a young woman dressed head to toe in a Spider-Woman spandex suit. For the staff watching from their desks, it was a surreal, jarring sight. For decades, Marvel had been the scrappy other player, the underdog that revolutionized fiction by giving us heroes with human problems. Peter Parker worrying about a sick aunt, or the Fantastic Four bickering like a real family. There was a sense that everyone was fighting the good fight, creating a modern mythology that soldiers carried into battle and kids around the globe treated as gospel. By the mid-'80s, they were finally on top, selling 50 million comics a year. But as the cigar smoke filled the executive suites, the atmosphere began to shift. The laughter and excitement of the bullpen were slowly replaced by something colder. Greed. Suddenly, comic books weren't being treated as stories, they were being traded like stocks. Speculators were buying issues in bulk, convinced they were holding paper gold, while the new owners viewed the characters as mere pieces in a high-stakes corporate game. The transition was instantaneous. One moment, Marvel was a storytelling titan. The next, it was a company being hollowed out from the inside. Within years, the House of Ideas would be on its knees, reduced to a battlefield of screaming phone calls, legal threats, and a bankruptcy filing that threatened to erase the Avengers and the X-Men from history forever. It raises a haunting question. How did the world's most successful narrative engine become a casualty of its own success? And what does it take to fight your way back when your heroes are already behind bars?
It's such a chilling image, isn't it? The cigar smoke replacing the ink fumes.
It really is. It feels like the start of a movie about a hostile takeover.
Which, in many ways, it was. And, I mean, it's a staggering fall from grace. But what we're going to do today is look at that fall not just as a piece of pop culture trivia, not just a remember when segment.
Right.
We want to treat this as a rigorous business case study. Our mission for this deep dive is to really deconstruct the mechanisms, both financial and cultural, that nearly killed this company, and then the very specific, almost accidental strategies that resurrected it.
And looking at the stack of research we have, there are bankruptcy court filings, historical analysis of the 90s comic market, and these incredibly dense reports on Asian media markets. It's clear this isn't just a story about superheroes punching bad guys.
Not even close.
It feels more like a story about financial engineering, regulatory strangulation, and this weird socioeconomic resonance of the struggling hero.
It's all of that. And to make sure we really understand the machinery under the hood, we're going to map this out in 3 distinct movements.
Okay.
First, we have to look at the money. You always have to follow money. We're going to dissect the financial collapse and what people call the investor wars of the 90s.
Right, the big Wall Street fight.
Exactly. And I want to juxtapose that against the structural risks we see in East Asian corporate giants, specifically the chaebol structure in Korea, and to some extent the keiretsu in Japan.
That's a fascinating angle. Then, after the money, we're going to pivot to the creative side. We'll look at how censorship, specifically the Communist Code Authority, almost strangled the industry in the cradle.
A stranglehold that lasted for decades.
Yeah. And compare that to the kind of bureaucratic oversight we see in Japanese and Korean media today.
And finally, we will land on the cultural connection. This is where it all comes together. We're going to explore the Parker luck. Peter Parker's perpetual struggle with money and life, and how that narrative mirrors the economic anxiety of young adults in Seoul and Tokyo right now.
Okay, that is a packed agenda, but I'm ready. Let's get right into the business of the bust. And to set the scene, I want to share a perspective from someone who was actually there on the ground floor when the floor fell out.
Oh, this should be good.
I heard a story once about a mid-level executive at a secondary Marvel distributor in the late 90s, a man named Robert who lived through the investor wars. He described the office as a ghost ship. While Spider-Man climbed walls on glossy pages, the suits in the boardroom were busy tearing the walls down. Carl Icahn and Ron Perlman were locked in a scorched earth battle for control, treating the House of Ideas like a mere pile of distressed assets. Robert recalled the day they filed for Chapter 11. He sat at his desk looking at a sketch of the Fantastic Four and realized that the Invisible Woman was a perfect metaphor for their capital. It had vanished into a vortex of overexpansion and junk bonds. To him, it wasn't just a business failure. It was a betrayal of a cultural icon. Looking at this from my perspective as a creator, it's a chilling parallel to the rigid hierarchies of the East Asian chaebol. When a corporation becomes too big to fail, the individual creativity that built it becomes a rounding error in a hostile takeover. I find it fascinating yet tragic how the same ruthless financial engineering that nearly killed Marvel often mirrors the structural risks in Seoul's corporate giants. We want to believe these companies care about the art, but in the 90s, Marvel was just a battlefield for men who didn't read comics.
That phrase, men who didn't read comics, it really sticks with you, doesn't it?
It says everything.
It's the key to understanding the entire collapse. When we look at the Ron Perlman era, which kicked off in 1989, we are looking at a classic, almost textbook example of what business strategists call a red ocean scenario. And it was all fueled by a leveraged buyout.
Okay, hold on. You're throwing around some MBA terms there. Leveraged buyout or LBO. I know that means buying a company, but walk me through the mechanics. How does someone buy a massive company like Marvel without really using their own money? That just sounds like a magic trick.
It effectively is a magic trick, but a very dangerous one. So imagine you want to buy a house that costs $1 million.
Okay, I'm with you.
But you only have, say, $100,000 in your pocket. In a normal world, you can't afford it. It's a non-starter. But in an LBO, you go to a bank and say, lend me the other $900,000. And for collateral, I'm not going to put up my own assets. I'm going to use the house I'm buying as the collateral.
Wait, so the house itself pays for its own mortgage. The asset secures the loan used to buy the asset.
Effectively, yes. The debt is transferred on to the company being purchased.
Okay.
So Ron Perlman buys Marvel for roughly $82.5 million. But our sources suggest he only put up about $10 million of his own cash. The rest, it was all borrowed money, high-interest junk bonds that ended up on Marvel's books.
That seems incredibly unfair to the company. You're basically strapping a lead weight to a swimmer and then yelling at them to swim faster.
That is the perfect analogy. And because they suddenly had this massive debt to service, Perlman couldn't just let Marvel be a nice, steady publishing house making a tidy profit. He needed what he called value extraction.
Sounds ominous.
It is. He needed massive growth immediately to pay off the loan sharks. He viewed Marvel not as a publisher of stories, but as a repository of intellectual property to be strip mined for every last cent.
And this is where the infamous speculator bubble comes in, right? I remember this era so vividly as a kid. Suddenly, comics weren't just for reading, they were investments. My friends and I, we weren't talking about the story in X-Men. We were talking about first appearances and keeping things in mint condition.
And that behavior wasn't accidental. It was engineered. Perlman's team saw that a small group of collectors were hoarding comics, and they thought, how can we make everyone do that? So they leaned into it hard. They started just pumping out gimmick covers.
Oh man, the gimmicks. I remember the foil covers that would blind you if the light hit them right. The hologram covers, die-cut covers where the cover literally had a hole in it for some reason.
Don't forget the glow-in-the-dark ones, or the poly bags. They would seal the comic in a plastic bag so you couldn't even open it to read it without destroying its value. Yeah, it's the cynical thing you can do to a story.
I remember specifically buying X-Men #1 in 1991. There were, 5 different covers that all connected to make one big poster image?
5 interlocking covers, yeah.
I bought all 5. I must have been 12. I didn't even read them. I just put them in a cardboard box thinking I was a genius investor.
You and millions of other kids. That issue sold over 8 million copies. It is still, to this day, the best-selling single comic book of all time. But think about the economics of that. They weren't selling 8 million stories. They were selling paper collectibles to maybe 2 or 3 million people who each bought multiple copies.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, they hiked the prices. They pushed the average price from around $1.50 to almost $3, effectively doubling the cost to the consumer. The cynicism here was it was palpable. They knew that if they put a hologram on the cover, a speculator or a 12-year-old kid would buy 5 copies instead of 1, thinking they were funding their future college tuition.
But that feels like a pyramid scheme. I mean, it's not sustainable. Eventually, you run out of 12-year-olds with allowance money.
That is exactly what happened. It's a definition of short-term gain for long-term ruin. For a couple of years, sales multiplied 6-fold. On a spreadsheet, Ron Perlman looked like an absolute genius.
Right, the numbers were going up.
But they were selling into a bubble of their own creation. They were diluting the brand. When you treat a story as a commodity, the audience eventually catches on that the content inside is hollow, or that their investment is worthless because everyone has one. When that bubble burst around 1993, sales didn't just dip, they plummeted 70%.
70.
The market just collapsed.
Wow.
The investors all tried to sell their paper gold at the same time and realized it was just the paper.
And while the comic sales are cratering, Perlman is still spending money, right? The sources mentioned he went on this bizarre shopping spree.
A chaotic, debt-fueled shopping spree. And this is where we really start to see that parallel to the Asian corporate structures. Perlman bought trading card companies like Fleer and Skybox.
Okay, that makes some sense. Comics, cards, collectibles. I get the logic.
A little bit, yeah. He also bought a sizable stake in a toy company called Toy Biz. But then, the most baffling move of all, he bought an Italian sticker company called Panini.
Wait, stickers? As in for sticker albums?
Yes, football stickers mostly, World Cup albums, that sort of thing.
Why on earth does a superhero comic book company based in New York need an Italian football sticker factory?
That is the billion-dollar question, isn't it? The logic on paper was synergy. The idea was that Marvel would own the entire pipeline, the characters, the cards, the stickers, the toys. But in reality, it was what business analysts call unrelated diversification. He was buying businesses he didn't understand, piling more and more debt onto Marvel's books. We're talking over $600 million in debt by this point.
600 million.
All without adding any real value to the core product, which was telling good stories in comic books.
So this brings us back to that comparison Robert made in the story, the chaebol connection. I know a chaebol is a Korean business conglomerate, like Samsung or Hyundai, but how does Marvel buying a sticker company really relate to that?
So in the traditional chaebol structure, and you see a similar thing with the Japanese keiretsu, you often have this massive sprawling web of cross-holdings. You'll have a central family-run holding company that owns a shipping company, which also owns a microchip factory, which also owns a life insurance firm, which also owns a chain of hotels.
It just sounds like a mess waiting to happen. How do you manage all that?
Well, it can be very efficient if it's managed perfectly, but it carries this massive inherent flaw that analysts call owner risk.
Owner risk.
Right. In the 90s, particularly during the Asian financial crisis of 1997, we saw several of these massive chaebols collapse under their own weight. The Daewoo Group is the most famous example. Daewoo was huge. They made cars, ships, construction equipment, consumer electronics, you name it.
Yeah, I remember Daewoo cars.
But they expanded too fast, took on way too much debt to buy all these unrelated businesses, and when one part of the empire faltered, the debt load became so heavy it dragged the whole thing down into bankruptcy.
So Perlman was essentially trying to build his own little pop culture chaebol.
Exactly. He was trying to build an empire on a mountain of debt, assuming that the sheer size of it would keep it all afloat. But just like Daewoo, when your core cash flow dries up, in Marvel's case, the comic book sales crashing, you can't pay the interest on the sticker factory or the trading card company, the entire structure just implodes.
Which leads us directly to the bankruptcy war of 1996 to 1998. The ghost ship era Robert was talking about. This sounds less like a business negotiation and more like a gladiatorial match.
It was a war. There's no other word for it. In one corner, you have Ron Perlman, the incumbent owner, desperately trying to restructure all this debt so he can keep control of the company. And then into the other corner steps Carl Icahn.
I've heard that name. He's usually described as a corporate raider, which never sounds good.
That's the polite term, yes. Icahn is a legend in the world of finance, but he's known for being absolutely ruthless. He saw Marvel was in trouble, so he started buying up its distressed bonds.
Distressed bonds, what are those?
It's basically Marvel's debt, the loans the company owed. They were trading for pennies on the dollar because everyone in the market assumed the company was going to die and the debt would never be repaid. Icahn swooped in and bought that debt for cheap.
Why? What was his goal?
His goal wasn't to save Spider-Man. His goal was to use that debt to gain leverage in the bankruptcy proceedings. He wanted to convert that debt into ownership, take over the company himself, and likely break it up for parts or liquidate it entirely to get his profit. He was the vulture circling the carcass.
So you have Perlman, who broke the company, fighting Icahn, who wants to scrap the company for parts. It really sounds like there were no good guys in this fight.
In the boardroom, there weren't. The atmosphere Robert described, the screaming matches over the phone, the constant legal threats, that was all real. It was a scorched earth battle between two billionaires fighting over the bones. But then you have the plot twist, the wild card, the Toy Biz guys.
Isaac Perlmutter and Avi Arad, the scrappy toy executives.
Right. They were already involved because Marvel owned a stake in their company, Toy Biz. But Perlmutter and Arad were different. They weren't pure financiers. They actually understood the product. Avi Arad in particular was a true believer in the IP.
He was a fan.
He was a super fan. He argued very persuasively that a toy is only as valuable as the story behind it. If a kid doesn't love Spider-Man the character, that kid is not going to buy the Spider-Man action figure.
Which seems so blindingly obvious, but I guess if you're a bond trader, you don't think that way?
To a bond trader, Spider-Man is just an asset entry on a spreadsheet with a projected revenue stream. To Avi Arad, he was a modern mythology. So the bankruptcy court had to decide who to give the keys to. The banks, the creditors who were owed all this money, they had to choose. Perlman offered a plan, Icahn offered his own plan, and Toy Biz offered a third plan.
And the banks actually sided with the toy guys, even though they weren't the big Wall Street billionaires.
They did. Even though, in some respects, the Toy Biz cash offer was technically lower than what Perlman was claiming he could generate. The banks and the judge looked at the situation and realized that Perlman and Icahn were just moving money around. They were financial engineers. Perlmutter and Arad, on the other hand, had a vision.
A creative vision.
A business vision rooted in creative. They argue that Marvel shouldn't just be a publishing company anymore. It should be a storytelling engine that fuels a global licensing empire, starting with movies. The creditors effectively bet on the storytellers over the bankers.
It is just incredible to think that the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, the billions of dollars, the biggest movies of all time, only exists because a bankruptcy judge and some bankers decided to take a chance on two guys who made action figures.
It was an incredibly narrow escape, and the resurrection that followed required a complete radical shift in strategy. And that brings us to Peter Cuneo, who was brought in as CEO in 1999.
Right, the turnaround king.
The turnaround king. He'd fixed broken companies like Clairol and Black & Decker.
And Clairol, the hair dye company.
The very same.
That doesn't exactly scream comic book expert.
And he was the first to admit it. He said he knew nothing about comics. But he didn't need to. He knew how to fix a broken business model.
Right.
And he immediately shifted Marvel from that red ocean strategy, fighting for inches of shelf space in comic shops with foil covers, to a blue ocean strategy. He looked at the market and asked, where is the uncontested space? Where are we not competing? And the answer was Hollywood.
But hadn't they been making movies before this? I vaguely remember a really terrible Captain America movie from the 90s, and the Blade movie was out by then.
They had licensed characters out, yes, but they were getting pennies on the dollar for it. They sold the film rights to X-Men to Fox and Spider-Man to Sony for these flat fees that, in hindsight, are just shockingly low. They weren't making the real money from their own success. Marvel wanted to start its own studio to have creative control and, more importantly, to keep the profits.
But they had no money. They were fresh out of bankruptcy. How do you start a movie studio with empty pockets?
You take the single biggest gamble in Hollywood history, the Merrill Lynch deal. This is the pivotal moment that changes everything. Marvel went to Merrill Lynch and somehow convinced them to set up a $525 million financing facility.
Okay, but a bank doesn't just give $500 million to a company that was literally bankrupt a year ago. What was the collateral? Normally, it's real estate or machinery or something tangible.
Marvel didn't have factories. It didn't have real estate. It had characters. So they put up the film rights to a bundle of 10 characters as collateral. This bundle included Captain America, Nick Fury, Thor, and the entire concept of the Avengers.
Wait, pause for a second. You're telling me that if the first few movies had failed?
If the first film out of the gate, Iron Man, had flopped, the bank would have owned the film rights to the Avengers.
So Captain America would have become the property of Merrill Lynch?
Yes. They could have sold those rights to anyone, Sony, Warner Bros., some random private equity firm. We likely never would have seen the MCU as we know it. The Avengers would have been split up and sold off at a corporate yard sale.
That is genuinely terrifying. They effectively bet the entire farm, the entire universe, on Robert Downey Jr.
It was the definition of an all-in bet.
Yeah.
And we should also mention one other little financial detail that gets overlooked but is so critical. The Chase Manhattan loan.
This is the post-commencement finance thing.
Yes, or DIP financing, debtor-in-possession financing. During the bankruptcy process itself, before the turnaround, before the Toy Biz guys even took over, the company had literally run out of cash to operate.
They couldn't make payroll.
They couldn't make payroll, couldn't pay the printers. Chase provided a $100 million loan that kept the lights on. It sounds boring and technical, but without that liquidity, the whole thing shuts down. The artists don't get paid, the printing presses stop. Spider-Man ceases to exist before Toy Biz can even ride in and save him.
So we have this incredible picture of a company that was financially strangled by Wall Street, almost dismembered by corporate raiders, and then saved by a high-stakes gamble on its own intellectual property. But money wasn't the only thing choking Marvel. There was also the stranglehold on creativity itself.
That's exactly right. If the debt was the shackle on the body of the company, then regulation was the shackle on its mind. And to really understand why Marvel's creative well was so dry by the time the 90s rolled around, we have to go way back and look at how they were culturally neutered decades earlier.
Let's pivot to that. I want to bring in our second perspective, this time focusing on that very impact of control and censorship.
A different kind of bankruptcy.
A creative one. I recently read an interview with a veteran manga editor in Tokyo who had been in the industry since the 70s. He spoke about the ghost of the code, referencing how the American Comics Code Authority of the 50s, which banned sympathy for criminals and disrespect for authority, actually stunted the growth of American storytelling for decades. He compared it to the subtle, Confucian-rooted bureaucratic oversight he faced in Japan and later saw in the Korean webtoon market. He remembered a specific artist who wanted to draw a gritty, realistic portrayal of social corruption, but was told to soften the edges to maintain social harmony. The editor lamented that while the U.S. eventually broke free, the instinct to self-censor for the sake of public morality remains a powerful, invisible hand in Asian markets, shaping which genres live and which die. As someone who analyzes media trends, I see this as a cautionary tale of how regulation can become a cage for culture. The 1950s U.S. crackdown was fueled by a moral panic that turned superheroes into bland caricatures. While I understand the desire for socially responsible content, I can't help but feel a sense of loss for the stories that were never told, because a bureaucrat, whether in D.C., Tokyo, or Seoul, decided they were too disruptive. It's a delicate balance between protecting the public and strangling the soul of the artist.
That story really just perfectly highlights the fundamental tension between social harmony and raw creative expression. And to understand the American side of this, specifically as it pertains to Marvel, we have to go back to 1954 and a man named Dr. Frederick Wertham.
Right, the author of Seduction of the Innocent. I've seen pictures of this guy. He looks like the classic 1950s stern academic, ready to wag his finger at you.
He was a psychiatrist who launched an absolute crusade. He claimed, with very little actual evidence, that comic books were the primary cause of juvenile delinquency in America. He testified before the Senate, and he did not mince words. He compared the comic book industry to Hitler.
Wow.
He claimed Batman and Robin were a gay fantasy designed to corrupt young boys, which was a huge scandal at the time, and that Wonder Woman was propaganda to turn girls into lesbians. It was a full-blown moral panic.
It sounds so ridiculous to us now, but people back then really bought this.
Parents were terrified. There were literal public comic book burnings in town squares across America.
They were burning comic books.
Yes. So to avoid the federal government stepping in and passing actual laws, the publishers panicked and formed the Comics Code Authority, the CCA. It was an act of self-regulation, but the rules they came up with were absolutely draconian.
Okay, so what kind of rules are we talking about?
Well, the manga editor in that story mentioned sympathy for criminals. That was a big one.
Yeah.
You could not, under any circumstances, show a criminal in a sympathetic light. They always had to be ugly or evil, and they always had to lose. You could not show disrespect for authority figures, police, judges, government officials. They always had to be shown as upstanding and correct.
So you literally couldn't tell a story about a corrupt cop or a crooked judge?
Absolutely not. It was forbidden by the code. They also had these explicit bans on specific words. You could not use the words horror, terror, or Walking Dead in a comic book title.
Walking Dead. So the entire zombie genre
was effectively made illegal in mainstream American comics for decades. This completely destroyed entire publishers, like EC Comics, which specialized in brilliant horror and crime tales like Tales from the Crypt. They just went out of business. But for Marvel, or Atlas Comics as they were known then, it meant they had to retreat into these very safe, very bland superhero stories. It infantilized the entire medium. For decades, you simply couldn't tell a story with any real moral ambiguity.
And how is this actually enforced? I mean, if I printed a comic with the zombie in it, would I go to jail?
No, but you would go bankrupt. And this was the insidious genius of it. The distributors, the powerful wholesalers who put magazines and comics on newsstands, they all agreed to simply return unopened boxes of any comic that didn't have the official Comics Code Authority seal stamped on the cover.
So if you didn't comply, you didn't get distribution.
You didn't exist economically. It was censorship through market forces.
That is incredibly effective. So how did they finally break it? Because obviously we have The Walking Dead today and very dark Marvel movies. Something had to give.
Ironically, it was the U.S. government that helped break the code that they had inadvertently inspired. In 1971, the Nixon administration's Department of Health, Education, and Welfare approached Stan Lee.
The government came to Marvel.
Yes. They wanted Marvel to write an anti-drug story. They saw comics as a way to reach kids and deliver a message that drugs are bad.
Okay, so the government asks for a public service announcement.
Stan Lee agreed, and he wrote a 3-part Spider-Man story where Harry Osborn, Peter Parker's best friend, gets addicted to pills. It wasn't glorifying drugs at all as a tragedy. It showed Harry popping pills, freaking out, overdosing, and ruining his life.
A true cautionary tale.
Exactly. But when Stan Lee submitted the story to the Comics Code Authority for approval, they refused to approve it.
Wait, why? It's an anti-drug story requested by the government.
Their rules were absolute and had no room for context. The code said you could not depict drug use, period, even if you were showing it as dangerous and destructive. The mere presence of the pills on the page was a violation.
That is just bureaucratic absurdity at its absolute finest. We can't show the bad thing being bad because our rules say we can't show the bad thing at all.
It's completely nonsensical. But Stan Lee did something unprecedented. He called his publisher, Martin Goodman, and said, print it anyway, without the seal.
That's a huge risk, a rogue move.
A huge calculated risk. And it paid off. They released the 3 issues, The Amazing Spider-Man numbers 96 through 98, without the code seal. And the issues sold incredibly well. Parents didn't revolt. The world didn't end. And that act of defiance broke the code's absolute power. It forced them to revise their rules, which slowly opened the door for more mature, more complex storytelling, the kind of storytelling that eventually allowed for The Punisher, for Wolverine, for the darker, more interesting Marvel universe we see in the films today.
Now, connecting this back to the story we heard about the manga editor in Tokyo, there's such a fascinating parallel there to the Asian markets. The editor mentioned Confucian bureaucracy and being told to soften the edges.
This is a really nuanced and important comparison. In the U.S., the control was explicit, a written code, a physical seal of approval. In markets like South Korea and Japan, the control is often much more implicit, rooted in deep cultural values of maintaining social harmony.
So it's not a list of banned words, but more of a cultural pressure.
Precisely. In the Korean webtoon market or the Japanese manga industry, there's often significant pressure. Sometimes it comes from government media rating boards, but just as often it comes from the editors themselves anticipating a public backlash. To avoid content that is seen as too disruptive or overly critical of social institutions.
Like that artist who wanted to draw the gritty story about corruption and was told no.
Right. If you critique the police too harshly in a mainstream Korean drama or webtoon, for example, you might face a public outcry for being anti-patriotic or for disturbing the social order. It's a form of soft censorship. The editor is effectively acting as the Comics Code Authority, but without needing a formal written rulebook.
It's the difference between a high brick wall and a deep cultural moat, but the end result is the same. Certain kinds of stories just don't get told.
Exactly. And just as the rise of the direct market in the U.S., the network of special comic shops that started in the 80s, eventually allowed Marvel to bypass newsstand censorship entirely and sell directly to fans, we are now seeing digital platforms in Korea allowing more niche adult genres to flourish outside of those traditional publishing gatekeepers. But that ghost of the code, as the editor called it, is a universal struggle. It's always the struggle of the individual artist against the constraint of public morality.
And that struggle leads us directly to the content itself, because you can have the financing and you can break free from the censors, but at the end of the day, you still need a character that people actually care about. You can't just have a blank page. And this is where Marvel really, really struck gold. Not with a billionaire or a god, but with a regular guy who can't pay his rent.
This is the third and I think most important pillar of our deep dive, the socioeconomic resonance. Why does Spider-Man, a character created in 1962 Queens, New York, resonate so deeply in Seoul, South Korea in the year 2026?
I have one last story to set the stage for this, and it's about a young man named Minho. Try to imagine a young man named Minho living in a Goseiwon, a tiny windowless room in Seoul, working 2 part-time jobs while trying to pay off his student debt. He doesn't see himself in the flawless, wealthy idols on TV. Instead, he finds solace in an old issue of The Amazing Spider-Man. He watches Peter Parker struggle to pay rent, fumble through social interactions, and fail to show up on time because of his responsibilities. Minho told a forum online that he felt Marvel's heroes were the only ones who understood the crushing weight of extreme urbanization. In the neon-soaked, high-pressure streets of Tokyo and Seoul, where the cost of living outpaces the soul, Peter Parker's Parker luck isn't a fictional trope. It's a daily reality for a generation of Sampo youth. This is where the political and the personal collide. I read stories like Minho's and I feel a deep empathy for the precariat class. While some might argue that focusing on these struggles is too negative or reflects a victim mindset, I believe it's the most honest form of storytelling we have. Marvel's success in these markets isn't just about flashy powers, it's about the shared exhaustion of the modern worker. It's a heavy realization, but perhaps acknowledging that even a superhero can't afford his rent makes the struggle feel a little less lonely for someone sitting in a tiny room in Gangnam.
The shared exhaustion of the modern worker. It's a profound insight.
Yeah.
When we really analyze the economics of Peter Parker, we're looking at this core concept Stan Lee and Steve Ditko created called the Parker luck.
Which to a casual fan can sometimes just look like bad writing. You know, oh look, Spidey lost his backpack again. But it's so much deeper than that.
It's specifically about financial and social failure. Think about the other big iconic heroes. Batman is a billionaire. His real superpower is effectively unlimited money. Superman is a god. He has a job as Clark Kent, but he doesn't need the paycheck to survive in the same way.
Right, he won't get evicted from the Fortress of Solitude if he's late on a deadline.
Exactly. But Spider-Man is defined by what he lacks. He can't pay his rent. He has this constant nagging anxiety about elder care with his Aunt May, who is always sick and needing medicine he can't afford. He gets fired from his pizza delivery job because he's out trying to save the city.
He is the gig economy hero before the gig economy was even a term.
That's a perfect way to put it. Originally, back in the 1960s, this kind of struggle appealed to American college students, the counterculture kids who felt alienated from the mainstream. But today, that same narrative maps perfectly onto the global precariat, this massive class of people living with precarious financial stability.
The story mentioned the Sampo generation in Korea. I've heard this term before, but can you really unpack it for us?
Yeah, Sampo literally translates to giving up three. It refers to a generation of young Koreans who have, out of economic necessity, given up on three things: courtship, marriage, and childbirth.
That is just incredibly depressing.
It is, but it's important to understand they don't give them up because they don't want them. They give them up because the economic pressure, the insane housing costs in Seoul, crippling tuition debts, low wages for entry-level jobs is so high that they feel they simply cannot afford to have a family.
And that is Peter Parker to a T. He is constantly sabotaging his relationship with Mary Jane Watson, not because he doesn't love her, but because his great responsibility, his burden, makes it impossible for him to be a normal, reliable partner.
He is the patron saint of the Sampo generation. In the hyper-urbanized, high-pressure environments of Seoul or Tokyo, where you can feel incredibly small and powerless in a city of millions, Marvel's street-level heroes just resonate so deeply. They aren't off fixing the galaxy. They are trying to keep their neighborhood safe while also keeping the lights on in their apartment.
And the data really backs this up, right? I mean, Marvel isn't just popular in Korea. It's a phenomenon.
It's huge. Avengers. Infinity War had nearly 1 million viewers on its first day alone in South Korea. That is a massive percentage of the entire country's population seeing it on day one. It's gotten to the point where Kevin Feige, the president of Marvel Studios, has explicitly stated that he views South Korea as a trend indicator for the rest of the world.
A bellwether market.
Exactly. If a Marvel movie works in Seoul, they know it will work in the rest of Asia and likely across the globe. And that's why you see them employ this first release strategy, where they now release all the big MCU films in Korea before they open in the US. They are building that critical word of mouth in the market that understands the struggle narrative the best.
And they've leaned into creating that authentic connection. It's not just lip service. They filmed a major auction sequence for Black Panther in Busan. They shot a big part of Age of Ultron right on the Han River in Seoul. It feels less like pandering and more like a genuine acknowledgement of that audience's importance.
And there's also an internal cultural element here that I just love. After the bankruptcy, when they were rebuilding, Marvel Studios adopted a corporate culture that perfectly mirrored this scrappy hero ethos. When Peter Cuneo and later Kevin Feige were getting things off the ground, they didn't operate out of a fancy Hollywood studio lot with fountains and statues.
Oh, where were they?
They worked out of a small office located above a car dealership in Beverly Hills.
You're kidding me. The Avengers were planned and assembled above a used car lot.
A Mercedes dealership, to be fair, but yes. The reports say they had old, mismatched furniture. There were no free lunches like at Google, no Lamborghinis for the executives like in the Ron Perlman era. This lean culture wasn't just about saving money. It created a corporate DNA that perfectly matched the struggling hero narrative they were selling to the world. They were hungry again. They were the underdogs again. And I really believe that authenticity bleeds into the final product. When you are fighting for your own corporate survival, you tend to write better stories about survival.
So when we bring it all together, it really feels like we've been looking at a perfect storm of failure and success.
It's a complete trifecta. You have the corporate greed of the Perlman era, that red ocean strategy, which almost killed the physical body of the company through suffocating debt.
Right.
Then you have the decades-long censorship of the code era, which almost strangled the creative soul of the art form. But in the end, what saved it all wasn't the billionaire financiers.
It wasn't Perlman or Icahn. They almost destroyed it.
Not at all. It was the toy guys, Avi Arad and Ike Perlmutter, who actually understood the fundamental value of the character in the story. And it was the core humanity of those characters, the Parker luck, the everyday struggle, that allowed the brand to survive bankruptcy and then go on to conquer the world. The business model, finally, after all those years, aligned with the narrative model. Struggle, survive, and then triumph.
It really makes you think about how fragile this all was, how close we came to losing this entire modern mythology.
It does. We often look at these pop culture titans like Marvel as inevitable, as these unstoppable forces of nature. Now, when you look back at the bankruptcy court files and the old censorship board records, you realize just how fragile these modern myths really are. It makes you wonder, if the Parker luck had finally run out in a Delaware courtroom in 1996, or if a censor had successfully banned that drug issue back in 1971, what stories are we currently losing right now in real time because the spreadsheet didn't balance or the regulator didn't approve? And perhaps more importantly, are we celebrating the art that survives, or just the assets that were successfully leveraged?